060 973, text 84850. Have your say with Ian Dale.
Well, a very warm welcome to the LBC Book Club, starting a little bit later than normal on a Monday evening. I'm joined by Owen Jones, who's written a book called Chavs. You didn't bring a copy of it with you, did you, by any chance, Owen?
Did I bring a copy?
No, you didn't.
I didn't, did I?
No.
I often have it looking around, but people have started accusing me of outright vanity, so...
Well, we'll talk about it in just a second. Richard Angell is here. He's the editor of the Purple Book, which is a collection of essays by various... co-editor, I should say, which is a collection of essays from various Labour luminaries, and indeed some people you've never heard of. But Peter Mandelson, Jackie Smith, they're among them. Richard, what was the point of the Purple Book? Why did you decide to bring it out?
Well, the reason why is that we obviously want Labour back into government as quickly as possible, but the time in which we're going to come back is going to be tough financial times, and we need to look at a way of governing that makes sure that we can have people's confidence, that we're not just going to spend all their money, in quotes, but going to change the public sector and change the way society is. So we give power away, and we want power so we can give it away to people, to communities, and we want that to happen in the public sphere, we want that to happen in the economy, we want that to happen in the way we run our public services and people experience life.
Now, we're also going to be joined in a couple of minutes' time, I hope, by Rowenna Davis. She's written a book called Tangled Up in Blue, Blue Labour and the Struggle for Labour's Soul. She did text me a minute ago to say she's in security, so she will be here in just a second. Now, the reason I wanted to get the three of you on is because you're all sort of from a younger generation of sort of left-wing thinking, and inevitably when a party goes into opposition, it's got to renew, it's got to refresh its ideas. And I think one of the interesting things about the way that your book's being received, Richard, is that a lot of people are accusing you of actually harking back to a sort of bygone era, a sort of you're sort of New Labour light. You want to reinvent the wheel of New Labour.
Well, the thing about New Labour is it was about people, it was about particular policies, but about positions. Now, the people are moved on in the past, and lots of them have said that. The policies were right for 97 to 2010, but that time has gone. But what was right is that we're tough on crime, that we focus on communities, that we are right on the economy, and that we have trust, and that we're focused on the centre ground to win elections. And so New Labour will kind of live on and regenerate itself by looking at the problems of the day, the way Owen has, the way Rowenna has, and seeking to apply those same principles and making sure we're on the centre ground of British politics so we can win for the left.
You sound like an echo of myself trying to explain why Margaret Thatcher is still relevant today.
But you believe that, and I believe that New Labour is still relevant today because I believe that the centre ground of politics is where you win things. Nobody won the last election, and nobody had caught the zeitgeist of the British public. We're looking forward to those challenges, and that's what we will look to do. And I think people want more power over their lives. The squeeze middle is about lots of people's insecurity, not feeling able to be the solution to some of the problems that are out there. And what we try to do through Trisham Hunt arguing for a more distributive ownership in the private sector, more mutuals, people feeling that they own the company they work for, feeling empowered about the solutions that they can then be about, whether in the squeeze middle or a more higher achieving for their kids in education, or how they feel as a victim of crime. And that's, I think, all really important stuff about, those who believe in the state and the power of it should also be champions of making it modern and relevant so we can win those elections, so we can change the country for the people we're in politics to represent.
We'll talk about your book in a second, but I want you to comment on what you... I don't know if you've read any of the Purple Book.
I haven't. I've just started leafing through furiously as we spoke. Look, I should say, I think, I think we need to have a debate as a party. I think that's absolutely crucial, but I was a bit concerned, actually. He said, these policies might have been right from 1997 to 2010, but obviously in 2010 we won absolutely catastrophically. It was the second worst.
We lost catastrophically.
You just said we won.
Did we? Oh God, we won catastrophically. No, I think
I would accept we lost very badly. Which is why I want to engage in new ideas, because we can't rerun that election. We've got to accept that we lost.
Absolutely, but as I should say before that bizarre slip, no, we lost absolutely catastrophically. It was our second worst defeat since 1918, and what worries me a bit about the Blairite faction. I hope Richard doesn't mind me describing him as such, because I think that's a fairly accurate summary of his politics.
The left is nothing without faction.
Well, absolutely. That's what this is the People's Judea Front out in force tonight. But look, we lost 5 million votes between 1997 and 2010. We actually lost 80% of those under Tony Blair. It's often not remarked upon.
You got all of them, though.
The Tories only actually won 1 million votes between 1997 and 2010. There wasn't this massive shift to the right. What should concern Labour is the fact that its working class voters stopped voting for it. Now, if we look at the class breakdown, actually, because there was always this idea, wasn't there, with New Labour, that Middle England, what they construed as Middle England, wasn't real Middle England, because Middle England is actually the median income, which is 21 grand a year. They were talking about the people at the top. But there was this idea that we had to keep those on board, whilst working class voters had nowhere to go. But that was disproven, because if you look at the polling breakdown, it was disproportionately working class voters who abandoned Labour, but more worryingly at all, there's a huge class gap in turnout.
Where did they abandon Labour, though? Because, as I understand it, for Labour to win the next election, they've actually got to win seats in the South East. Ben Bradshaw was saying at a fringe meeting I was chairing earlier that Labour now only hold 10 seats. If you draw a line from Bristol to the Wash, Labour, and exclude London, Labour has 10 seats, which is an incredible statistic. And it's not just about the working class, it's about getting back, though, Worcester woman, sort of Essex man, the people that voted in Margaret Thatcher, the people that voted in Tony Blair, those are the people you've got to get back, not necessarily just the working classes.
Well, no, the Labour...
I just hate that expression anyway, actually. It's so 1940s.
Well, I obviously don't agree with that for reasons I'm sure we'll explore shortly, but Labour's always been a coalition of working class people and progressive middle class people, and on that I think me and Richard certainly do agree. But actually, even in the South, we lost working class southern voters. There's this idea, I think, that to be working class, it's this sort of northern industrial, flat cap on, down the pit. But actually, we lost... Ed Miliband himself, during the leadership election, we haven't heard much of this sort of rhetoric since he won, but he said there was a crisis of working class representation, and he pointed out what pollsters call the DEs, that's a group right at the bottom of the polling categories. If Labour had just kept that vote between 1997 and 2010, it would have emerged as the biggest single party in the last parliament, in the last election. So actually, I do think there is a real point, because actually the people at the top, the ABs, we actually largely kept those voters. So I think when we're trying to address why we won, we need to talk about things like there's 5 million people on social housing waiting lists in this country. That's because New Labour refused to build council housing, which meant we didn't meet people's housing needs. There's a real problem with job insecurity. Wages were stagnating and declining even before the crash hit. All of those are issues we think we need to address, and I worry that this this purple book is actually just an attempt to return to a bygone Blairite era of privatisation, and frankly sops to the rich who are flourishing as never before, even at a time of economic crisis.
Is gagging to respond.
What you will enjoy about our book, Owen, is that actually it looks for those challenges as we go forward. It focuses on the voters that Ian talked about, that we must win in the South East, and those in the kind of commuter ring around London who did disproportionately believe we spent too much money and want a way of us coming back, protecting their public services and finding a way to fund them sustainably. But the great thing is that Caroline Flint talks about how we get more people into housing, how we make sure we regulate the private rented sector so that it is a way of helping people through. You've got Tristram Hunt talking about pre-distribution. How do we make sure we don't have...
You see, pre-distribution, I haven't got a clue what that means, and I'm sure not many people would. Why use language that, frankly, nobody understands?
Because we want to be an intellectually developed party, we've got to think about what those future ideas are. It is important that we have a sense of where we're going.
I'm a clever guy. I can understand big words, but I haven't got a clue what that means.
But we can talk about that amongst ourselves. We're having a conversation about people on the left about how we do win next time. But what it means to people is a living wage for people. What it means is...
Say that then.
Well, OK, what it means to people is working in a company that's mutually owned, where you know who your boss is and you have a relationship with them and you have a stake in that company being successful, and you then making sure your wages aren't squeezed as a result of it.
But you see, that just... Have you ever run a business?
I've worked in private business.
Because you see, I think I think I've deleted it from... No, I've got it here. Lord Miners, former business minister, said tonight, he's written a piece for The Guardian tomorrow, basically says that nobody in the shadow cabinet has got any business experience. They need to acknowledge that. He says that this needs correcting. If this is done, we might see the emergence of more serious pro-growth policies and some of the inept and inconsequential nonsense that previously masqueraded as business policy. And this comes from the former business minister. Now, when you say things like that, I think to myself, well, I run a business that I employ about 20 people, and I mean, what you've just said means nothing to me. I'm thinking, why should I do all of these things? I think I run my business in a responsible manner. If all my employees came to me and said, well, we'd quite like to sort of have some sort of mutual interest, or whatever phrase that you use, I would consider it. But in the end, it's me that's taken the risk of starting this business, no one else.
And that should be rewarded, and we want to. And look at the conference we're at. We have private sector companies, big and small, all coming, engaging with the Labour Party, talking about it. The theme of this conference is growth and opportunity. How do we get people back to work, and how do we make sure we've got those companies? We know growth isn't going to come from the public sector the way it did over the last 13 years. It's going to come from more private sector enterprising, more small businesses, and we want to support that. And the Labour Party is completely relaxed about that and wants to see that going forward. But what we want is people to feel a stake at work, to feel empowered in their workplace, and to make sure going to work is something that they enjoy. That's a good thing.
I'm going to ask Rowenna Davis, who's just sat down. Welcome to the programme, Rowenna. She's the author of Tangled Up in Blue, Blue Labour and the Struggle for Labour's Soul. What does pre-distribution mean to you?
Pre-distribution?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
I rest my case, Richard Angell.
I have
Anyway.
no idea. But I think one thing that, language is a point that's pretty important to Blue Labour, because I think for a long time...
What is Blue Labour? Come on, just define that before we start.
Blue Labour is about saying... When we were in power, Labour was too hands-off with this market and too hands-on with the state. And what it needs to do is rediscover its traditions in community. It needs to start talking about things that matter to people. Like, when was the last time you were on the radio and you heard a politician talking about something that actually resonated with them, something like family or friendship or neighbourhood or community or belonging
We
or,
had Ed
or
Balls
dignity
talking
in
about
work?
playing football.
We always have families, don't we?
Yeah,
We always talk about hard work.
No,
and
actually,
families.
no. I think actually the Conservatives have often talked about family, but in a meaningful way. I think that Labour's been a bit frightened about talking about family for quite some time because it's associated with Conservatives, which it shouldn't be, but that's the way it has been.
But, I mean, I suppose my concern about that is there's often a quite rigid definition of family, isn't there? Because I think, for example, a single parent is a family. I think a gay couple is a family. And often when people talk about family, it brings up this idea
Exactly.
of the nuclear family in a very traditional sense, and people feel stigmatised by that.
Do you think that's still the case, though? I mean, I think you're right. 20 years ago, you would have thought of sort of 2.4 children, Volvo in the drive, and all of that sort of thing. I think that's changed now.
I think it has, but I mean, I don't know how many people it has in the Conservative Party who are still very anti sort of gay marriage, for example. But certainly, as a woman, it has worried people when they talked about the family, because what it tends to mean is, are we going to be, asked to go back in the home if we care about family? But there are very kind of modern ways of doing that still celebrate those important bonds.
Well, much more from my panel in just a few moments' time. It's 9:45. And it's time for Alan Joyce's Travel Bulletin.
Thanks, Ian. Well, still severe disruption on the trains in and out of King's Cross tonight. All mainline services are still badly disrupted because of ongoing signal problems just outside of King's Cross. They're just running a very, very limited service at the moment, affecting the East Coast Main Line and First Capital.
Have your say with Ian Dale.
Now, coming up with Anthony Davis at 10. Labour has fallen behind the Conservatives in an opinion poll published on the eve of Ed Miliband's high-profile speech to the party's annual conference here in Liverpool. Anthony wants to know, if you were to head out and vote tomorrow, who would get your vote? Also, after Ed Balls reveals his 5-point plan for a better economy, do you feel his ideas are realistic? Anthony also wants to know what your points to a better future are in general. Do we have a great future ahead? Plus, with the arrival of the new Boeing 787 Dreamliner, are you ready for a revolution in air travel? All that and more with Anthony Davis from 10 o'clock. Let me reintroduce my book club panel to you. Rowenna Davis is here. She's a journalist on The Guardian. I think I'm right in saying, he says, looking at her plaintively.
I'm a journalist who writes for The Guardian and other papers.
And other papers. She's touting herself around. Or tarting herself around. Well, I don't know
that
which
if I
it
was
is.
a man.
Yeah, I would actually. I do. I can promise you I would. God, don't start. Tangled Up in Blue is her, but I don't know, we invite her onto the programme to publicise a book and she insults me. Tangled Up in Blue, Blue Labour and the Struggle for Labour's Soul. I accuse myself of whoring myself about the media, so I can assure you I would say that. Owen Jones is here, another media tart. He's all over the media.
I'm glad you said
at the moment.
media tart.
Yeah, exactly. He's written a book called Chavs, which we're going to be talking a lot more about in this section of the programme. And The Purple Book, which we've talked a lot about in the last bit. Richard Angell is the co-editor of that. Owen, let's start with you. It's a very evocative title that you've chosen, and it's been very successful. What drove you to write your book?
Above all, it was to try and reopen a debate on class in however limited or modest a way. I don't have delusions of grandeur over it, but I thought it was a debate which had been shut down for a number of years. New Labour's position was we're all middle class now. That was obviously something which the Tories embraced too. So I wanted to challenge that. There's this idea, everyone had become middle class. The old working class had either become aspirational and then become middle class, and all that remained of it was this feckless, problematic romp. And that, I think, that was kind of the main aim of the book. It wanted to take that on. And also this idea, which gained common currency, again, both amongst the Tories and New Labour, that social problems weren't social problems. They were to do with people's individual failings, that if you were poor or you were unemployed, it's because you were lazy, you were feckless, you were work shy. And obviously that idea was used to take on the welfare state, because why have a welfare state if it's just subsidising people's personal failings?
But there are people that fall into that category. You would accept that? Because Ed Miliband seemed to have it was in the Mail on Sunday, so draw your own conclusions. But, the Mail on Sunday story said that Ed Miliband refused to even accept in a speech. He wouldn't refer to benefit cheats, yet we all know there are benefit cheats.
I'm glad he did do that, because the problem is there's this stigmatisation of all people on benefits. So associating benefits with people who cheat is really problematic. Because let's be honest, there is actually benefit fraud in this country. All financial systems have elements of fraud in them. But actually, if you look at the amount of benefit fraud there is, it's about £1.2 billion a year. It's less than 1% of all welfare spending.
Quite a lot of money, though. You could do a lot with 1.2 billion.
But let's think about it. It's less than £1 in every £100 spent on welfare is lost to fraud. And yet, that's not the amount of coverage benefit fraud gets. Whenever we talk about benefits, it's this idea of people milking the system, scroungers. I think that's really problematic, because we live at a time of mass unemployment, and that's not because people were feckless or lazy. It's because we're in the middle of an economic crisis caused by the banks who got left off the hook, and we've ended up in a situation where those who are getting kicked because of this economic crisis are those at the bottom. And I think when we look at, for example, compare benefit fraud to tax evasion, that costs us £70 billion a year. So I think that's what we should be focusing on, rather than finding ways to demonise people at the bottom.
Rowenna Davis, what could Blue Labour do for the working classes?
Wow, that's a huge question and a really important one. At the moment, I think what Blue Labour is saying is that for a long time, Labour has become technocratic, managerial, and it's become disconnected from the people who once gave it a sense of spirit and once a sense of soul. And what Blue Labour wants to do is to reconnect with them by reconnecting the values that chime with them, and to recognise that for a long time people just do look at New Labour now and just think it's quite elitist. And what I think it wants to say is, at the moment we've been giving a lot of economic transfers to people, but actually that's not enough. And this is quite interesting because it relates to Owen's point, right? So a lot of people have criticised Blue Labour for saying that actually it just wants to cut state spending. But actually the problems that Blue Labour has with the welfare state have got nothing to do with transferring money to poorer people. It's got to do with the fact that they didn't quite empower them enough. And so a lot of people have been left on benefits for too long, and often actually have been left feeling disempowered, and have often left feeling lonely. So some of the biggest opposition to benefits comes from people who are actually on them or actually in receipt of them. And I think what Blue Labour would say is, look, we need a bit more reciprocity here. We need to say to people, look, we want to give you a hand, but we also want you to do something else in return, if it's possible for you to do that. And one example that's really come up is like James Pennell's Jobs Fund. So what he says is, if you've been unemployed for a year, you will have guaranteed work at the end of that year. And that costs state money to be able to provide that job for that work,
but
for that
person. Real work?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, if you don't take that job, then your benefits are cut. And that's what it says to people. And it says that actually, if there's any time when you're receiving something where you're not actually asked to provide something and respond, then that can be humiliating for that person.
See, let me read you a tweet here from someone, which I think is quite interesting. It says, your panel are typical lefties who want to meddle in everyone's lives and everyone's business. Pre-distribution, dear oh dear. Now, there is a dividing line here between the left and the right, isn't there? Whereas people on the right will generally want a smaller state, want the state to do less. And people on the broad left are quite happy for the state to do more, and sometimes that can be perceived, Richard Angell, as meddling in people's lives.
I think that's what the Purple Book tries to address. It's about, we want power to give it away and make sure people have power of their own lives. But the pre-distribution point was about actually making sure people have ownership over their wages, that they get a living wage where they work and they feel empowered to campaign for that and fight for it and secure it. And I think that does matter to people and will mean stuff to people.
Owen.
Well, I think actually, if we look at what's dominating people's lives, I think there's a good point to be made that it's the market which has huge dominance over people's lives. I mean, we're now in the middle of an economic crisis which wasn't caused by overspending, and I hope we can all agree on that.
No, we can't. It was partly caused by
No, it wasn't. It was
overspending.
caused by a huge collapse in tax revenues provoked by an economic crisis because Labour failed to regulate the banks properly, so that needed state intervention to counter market power.
And
it failed to
save while the sun was shining.
Well, I don't accept that. I think the main... I mean, the Tories backed Labour's spending plans pound for pound until the end of
Mistakenly, in my
2008. But the fact was there was a huge collapse in tax revenues, and spending went up partly because, in part, large numbers of people were thrown out of work, and therefore welfare expenditure went up. So that's why but the point I'm making is we're living in a situation, a huge economic crisis caused by market dominance and the failure of the state to step in and regulate the banks properly. I think we all agree on that now. The Tories in opposition at the time were saying that the banks needed less regulation, but they're keeping pretty stum about that
Well,
now.
I think what they're saying is that they need better regulation. Maybe not more, but better, because it did
Probably a little
more
bit
and
stricter.
better.
I think most people, I think the consensus...
Three on one here, I'm feeling in the
You're
minority.
taking some regulation away to bring it back with different ones. I mean, I think people agree it's more and better. I think the penalty is there's a sense that it was too much of all of it, and people do feel powerless about a whole load of things that they feel in their
Rowenna
lives.
Davis.
I think the problem with Labour was that we were so busy focusing on the kind of smaller issues that we didn't need to regulate. The things like CRB checks, having to have maybe 9 or 10 CRB checks to do different youth work in different areas, for example, is over-focusing on the micro issues, whilst meanwhile letting these huge financial transactions happen without just turning a complete blind eye to them. And actually what we should have said is we've got faith in people to be able to take their kids to school and without regulating or monitoring them. But when it comes to giant global transactions, when people are gambling with our savings, it might have been worth actually being a little bit more hands-on with the state there.
Well, we've sadly come to the end of our time, because we could have gone on for another 3 hours at least, I think, anyway. Let me just tell you the 3 books that we'd all like you to buy. Tangled Up in Blue, Blue Labour and the Struggle for Labour's Soul, is by Rowenna Davis, published by Ruskin Publishing at $8.99. Owen's book... Owen's book is called Chavs, The Demonising of the Working Class, is published by Verso at $14.99.